All right, there we go. Sorry, I was muted and I couldn't unmute myself. Hi, welcome everyone to our distinguished speaker today for the EWB network, who's sponsoring the talk today with InCHIP, and we're really delighted to have Dr. Proulx with us today. I've known Dr. Proulx, or Jeff. Known him since he was a graduate student back in the day, and it's been really delightful to see his career develop. He worked with a good friend of mine out of Oregon State, Carolyn Alwyn, and lots of folks out in Oregon. And he continues his bicoastal work, so it's just wonderful to have him here with us today. So his work focuses on development of mindfulness programs in underserved communities and how these programs may be protective for health in these communities. His efforts bridge Native American and African American traditional contemplative and healing practices and mainstream mindfulness practices, and how mindfulness affects resilience and well-being across developmental trajectories. His work includes studying changes in physiological markers such as cortisol and blood sugar levels, relationships to stress, and how responses to stress earlier in life may affect health later in life. So with that, I will turn it over to Jeff. And we decided to hold questions till the end, so you can put them in the chat, or just we'll do hand raising at the end. So thank you so much for being here today, Jeff. Well, here in spirit, that we say.
Yeah, here in spirit for sure. Thank you, Crystal, and very much in spirit. Thanks everybody for having me. And I'm really honored to be a part of this project, especially just focusing on well-being and wellness. That's my work. And as Dr. Park mentioned, right now I'm at Brown University. I work in the School of Public Health, but I also have appointments in the School of Medicine at Brown and also at OHSU in Portland. And the reason why I point that out is that a lot of my work is very much focused on the looking at how stress affects individuals and how that affects us in the long term. What could be the long-term implications of stress in different communities? And so what I want to do is talk about some of the research that we've done and walk through some of the ways that we've worked, particularly in Indigenous communities, for a couple of different reasons. One is to just look at the differences and thinking about research, and also looking at the differences of the things that our communities can offer for mindfulness in general. And then I would hope to get to the end and we can do a contemplative practice of some of the stuff that we've done, using some of the knowledge that we've learned. So slide, please. So my work, and this is almost a little bit backwards, but my work is, I'm Indigenous, I'm Mohawk. I should probably point that out first, and I do want to take the opportunity to ask everybody to recognize and be aware of the peoples that originally inhabited the lands that we're all on right now. I'm in New York right now, so that would be, I think, the Seneca, which was a part of the Six Nations that I was a part of, and Brown University being on the land of Narragansett. And we'll talk a little bit more about Narragansett. But considering that we are in the midst of these communities, much of my work then is focused on working with these communities, and if we're developing health interventions in these different communities, and we're looking at using traditional ways of either medicine or healing, we're going to want to have a really strong input from the community. And in general, with just intervention development in general, I believe it's really important to engage with the community, that your likelihood of success really goes up. It's much higher. But it gives people an opportunity to learn about some of the experiences different communities have had. So, for example, I've done a little bit of work in Portland, Oregon, with the African American community there, and looking at ways of developing mindfulness within the Black church in Portland. And one of the things that we came to understand early is that a lot of the earlier social conditions that basically not just gentrification, but the removal of people from different neighborhoods held a really strong long-term stressor and was an injury that people still continue to carry on and felt that was a stressor for their community. And these are just things that we were able to just learn by interacting and working particularly with elders in those communities, and starting to realize that a lot of the things that we measure, stress, anxiety, in research may look a lot different in the communities that we work in. And so we want to be able to use CBPR for us to be able to understand what those differences may be. So slide. And so thinking about some of these differences, my early on work as an undergrad was focused on Indigenous mental health. And one of the key influences that came up around Indigenous mental health was the influence of stress and intergenerational trauma, and recognizing that a vast majority of, or at least a huge amount of Indigenous people in America suffer from traumas that have been passed from one generation to another. And so understanding stress in this community isn't just thinking about, did I get into an argument today, or did I, you know, was I injured, or whatever normal daily stressors might be, that those are often compounded with physiological and psychological differences that are generated from intergenerational trauma. And several different researchers have gone to posit, at least, that this interaction of stress and trauma across the lifespan and the life course is associated with a lot of poor health outcomes, such as diabetes, substance abuse. In Indigenous communities, I do a lot of work around cardiovascular health and hypertension. It's a major problem in these communities, and as what I also came to realize that a lot of these diseases that I'm interested in the long term, Alzheimer's or diabetes or hypertension, are also associated with stress. And so, thinking that if we could do something to reduce stress in these communities, perhaps we can have a much different outcome in a lot of these health issues. Slide. And so I began to think, and I was a mindfulness practitioner. I was still an undergrad, and I started thinking that maybe mindfulness could be a way of working in Indigenous communities to reduce stress. Problem is that also at the time I was very much focused on culturally centered research and therapy as important, because it really draws, at least in particularly in Indigenous communities, draws people in to the intervention. It gives people things that they could grasp onto. It gives people meaning. There's just a lot of ways that I've spoken with Indigenous people that they need to feel that they're getting Indigenous content, that the intervention understands them, if that makes sense. And so in the past, people have brought in things like being able to incorporate the medicine wheel or talking circles, and there are a lot of different and clever and effective ways of being able to do this that I've experienced across the Northwest in particular. And overall, we being kind of the community of people interested in this type of Indigenous mental health, we're pretty certain that this would increase the likelihood of being able to have success with different people, but also have success with getting support from the communities that we worked in, is by focusing on that Indigenous centered treatment. So once again, though, coming back to the mindfulness thing, is that mindfulness doesn't really fit a lot of these things that I just talked about, being particularly the way I practiced it as being Eastern based, with a very strong Buddhist influence in the beginning, at least, and involving exercises that I never really saw on the reservation or around different Indigenous communities. So I was sort of stuck there. So slide. And so what I became to start thinking is like, well, what sort of mindfulness practices or what sort of native traditions? Because one day I was watching people do a jingle dress dance, and or maybe it was stomp dance. And one of the things I noticed was that the steps and the attitude that people were, it was very mindful, for lack of a better word, that it was very intentional, it's very purposeful, and people had to be very much in the present moment. Given the definition of mindfulness as John Kabat-Zinn may see it as mindfulness as being in the present moment, non-judgmentally. I might be getting these backwards, but without judgment, on purpose, and to just be in this present moment. And so these dances that I was looking at were very much that. So I started thinking about what's a way of thinking about what other Native traditions are also mindful that we could bring into these interventions. So that way, what it could get to is that, and that we would be able to center tradition in health intervention, but that using that tradition as the vehicle itself towards that overall health. So then I ran into another problem, is that there's several hundred different Native nations in just America, let alone Canada, and they're all there's a lot of things that they share, but there's also a lot of things that are different. So we couldn't come up with this pan-Indian sort of intervention. So that was also problematic, because about this point I was starting to get some funding to do this work, and people wanted to see a product, an intervention, something that was created. So I was kind of, especially working with the National Institutes of Health, was sort of they very much wanted a standardized intervention. And I just said, I don't think that's something that we can do, though. So next slide. So there was we did start seeing some, I was working with, Proulx and Gobert early on. This is just a little bit of background and some of the ways that people were starting to bring mindfulness to Native communities. Is Lee and Gobert were invited to Montana to work with an Indigenous tribe there that had a high suicide rate. And so one of the main things that I got from them, because I was able to be very much influenced by this work, but they went to the elders and they got blessings and they got stories and they got things that they felt that could be implemented into the interventions. And they noticed that it helped with being able to make connections with people in the community and to be able to recruit people and help with the feasibility and acceptability of the entire study. And from I don't know, I haven't updated this in a while, but at least mindfulness continued to be a part of the community for quite a while after they left. The next slide. And also, Tao and myself I did some. We were involved in an intervention in Hawaii that was at the request of a corrections facility for teens there that had mostly mixed ethnic Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander youth. And so what we were thinking that mindfulness would be a good way of helping to the corrections people were just looking for a way to keep the kids calm, and we said this could be a really good way to do that, but it could also be important for them because we incorporated the concept of aloha into the mindfulness intervention, which I can't speak to as much as Tao could, but it provided that that access, that point of recognition that I was talking about in Indigenous communities, that people felt like they were connected to the intervention, that meant something to them. And the results showed that they were, both in questionnaires and also a couple of the biomarkers that we looked at, it had a positive outcome for the kids. So next slide. So now, we're starting to learn some things about, what might be appropriate for Indigenous communities. We're starting to think about, what works, and also more importantly is starting to understand what do we need to do to be able to access these communities, to be able to continue to get valuable data, and to be able to continue to create programming. And one of the and this is a new term for a lot of people, but I was very much influenced by Michael Yellowbird, who's now at the University of Manitoba, who has, and this might be something to look up, but he's focused on neurodecolonization, because what Dr. Yellowbird's theory is that colonization in North America was so thorough and was so devastating that it's actually affected the neural networks and what neural networks that people use in their brains. And he's saying that there's neurocolonization that's happened. And so for Yellowbird, he says that we need to, at least for Indigenous people, need to engage in neurodecolonization. And for him, that's engaging in traditional ways of being, traditional ways of healing, learning the songs, learning the dances, learning the history, learning the different practices that people have done, and making them a part of Indigenous people's lives. Not like fully all the time, but certainly at a point of bringing them and internalizing these different native traditions. And what Yellowbird posits is that if people are doing that, it would restructure those neural networks. It relies on neuroplasticity, and knowing that we could still, even as adults, be able to restructure our own neural networks and choose by habit what neural networks that will actually go into effect when we're dealing with, like, perhaps, let's say, stress, or dealing with a trauma in the community. That neural decolonization provides for a way that people could unwind that the responses, the reactivity that people may have, and provide for a much better way of responding to things through perhaps traditional ways. And so we were driven very much by that, but also, when he was pointing out that we really need to get a commitment from the community, and we need to show that, or I need to show that I'm wanting to be a part of the community, that I'm an advocate for the community, that, I'm going to the IRB meetings, being at these things. I do work in a lot of different Indigenous communities in the States, but I was recently in California after the pandemic had somewhat subsided. So we were able to have a first council meeting in person, and I wanted to go and update them because we had actually been doing stuff during the pandemic. It turns out Zoom is a very useful tool for people who do work in, like, rural medicine. So, we were able to make access to patients and to community members that we otherwise didn't have. So we were doing stuff during the pandemic. But so I wanted to update the council about all that. And one of my partners at the tribe came up to me. She said they were just really, really, really happy to see you. And I was, surprised, because I don't think that highly of myself. And but she said the main thing is that you came back, that they have a lot of, people show up at these communities, and they reach out, and they want to do work, and they want to do all this stuff, and then they just sort of disappear on communities. And they said that's generally been the habit, and that me continuing to come back, and I've been there for years. I was actually surprised that they were wondering about whether I would or not, whether I would come back. And these are, I think, one of the things just to think about as far as anybody who might do work in underserved populations, of just understanding, like, what are some of the realities, some of the psychosocial and historical realities that might go into the success of setting up programming in those communities. And a lot of that is being there, being present, being consistently present. And a lot of really what I came to is as I learned more from different communities around the country, whether it be Paiute or Narragansett or Mohegan or Cherokee or whatever, Chickasaw, I was finding that the power of these practices was so incredible that I wasn't so much interested in what mindfulness could do for Indigenous communities as much as then at a point of, like, what could Indigenous communities, how could they, like, help mindfulness communities? So next slide. And some of the stuff that I've done in the past is making sure that I've paid attention to, like, language and consent forms. One time I was at OHSU, and interesting story, I was doing research with Navajo in Arizona, and just before I arrived at Navajo, the Havasupai, if I'm saying that right, nation had just sued, I think, Arizona State because they had misused some of their genetic data that was on that they had sitting in a desk somewhere. So and they sued them and they made it hurt because they were saying you just can't use our biomarkers and our native any body parts without having a very, very strict amount of respect and highest amount of respect and communication. So then I showed up in Navajo saying, "Oh, I want your blood," and I was a little bit nervous about that. But they said, "Yeah, it was okay," because I had made sure that I had made a protocol that would show how I would be using their biomarkers. And I was also it was important to me that if you read HIPAA, the way it's written, and I worked for OHSU, so being a med school, they emphasized that we had to have HIPAA signed. And there was a HIPAA form we had to have done. And the way it was written in HIPAA, is that they could reuse these biomarkers for as long as we wanted. It was our property. And we could do whatever we wanted with it, and that the participant should kind of expect that and not have any problems with it. And I didn't like I'm paraphrasing, of course, but I didn't like the way the language was written. So I said, I can't have my community members sign this. And actually the chair of the IRB was in my office, and I was saying I'll close the study before I have them do this HIPAA thing, and I was willing to do it. And they said and then finally OHSU they stepped back and they made changes so that way it didn't have to have that language in there. But I think being able to show that kind of commitment to your communities in order to have them protected, I think it's important for them to know and to see from you as researchers. Back to that research thread again. But also, I think just all of these things I think are just really critical to gaining that trust. It's important for us to gain trust because people are going to be sharing with us very sensitive and sacred things. And I think once we got to that point, things really started to open up for us. So next slide. And a lot of, I think, is back to research again. I think is coming in and being able to say all the time, if you do, all Indigenous communities have an IRB that you need to go through. So there's research, you have to go through your own university IRB, but then there's Indigenous IRBs to go through. And I tend to now put the Indigenous IRBs first and make them the IRB of record. And then once they approve my study, then I submit it to Brown or to OHSU or whoever, and they become the secondary. But on all of those documents, the main thing that comes up is, what are you going to do for us? And it's really important to have a very strong answer to that. So you go ahead to the next slide. And some of the things that came out of over time, basically what we would do is we would, we'd deliver mindfulness classes, and we'd have Indigenous people take them, usually mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, which I'm the most familiar with. And I'm a trained MBSR teacher, and so and also MBSR has a really wide range of research and validation that goes along with it. So we know a lot about the mechanisms of MBSR, like what a body scan does and what sort of benefits that we can expect to see in research, like perhaps better sleep or reduced reports of pain. Or doing mindful eating exercises, and we can look at data that shows that there's reductions in harmful ways of eating, people who do some of these things. So there's a lot of, that's one of the reasons I use MBSR, is I can think about each one of the components of MBSR and think about what it is that component offers, and then look for a correlate in the Indigenous community, and just basically doing that from having people take the classes, and then a whole lot of recorded interviews and focus groups. And also what I learned early on was that when I'm doing an MBSR class with Indigenous people, one of the places that the best information came up was actually in the class. So I started actually recording all of the classes that we did, and with obviously everybody's consent. because people would come up with the most important and intriguing organic things that would come out of that, out of their experience, you know, talking about their previous week's homework or talking about their experience with a particular meditation thing. And the insight was just incredible. And we started to look for different ways of thinking about success, you know, and really changing our perspective on what is the success and what is our goals and what are our pitfalls and what are our benchmarks. You know, when we wanted to make those become more focused on indigenous ways of seeing things and looking for nature as our guide, like as nature telling us and listening to nature to be able to tell us which ways to go, and looking at how walking meditation and things like beading are also mindful, and basket weaving and ways of being able to express different ways of things like the importance of certain health aspects through storytelling, you know, and then more importantly is and in all the communities that I work in, we would find somebody who's very, and usually someone who's interested in mindfulness, but definitely somebody who has been recognized and is willing to take the role on as a community healer, who can also get trained in mindfulness teaching, but be able to be the one then that becomes and like, so we have people going through the MBSR teacher training program at Brown, and we're covering their cost, and we've opened up a new teacher training program for people who serve BIPOC communities and underserved communities in general. So there's a lot of different streams that we can get people to come through and become trained in these mindfulness teachings, so they have that formal thing, but then they can bring in their particular tribes, traditions and songs and cultures and ways of smudging. And so the main thing is that, you know, over time, after we've done the program development, that I can leave, but that program continues on in that community. And we're just these things are popping up all over the country, which has just been great, at Cherokee and at, like I said, at Paiute on the West Coast, here in New England, and all over the place. So next slide. So this has been expanded out. I wanted to point out at one of my colleagues that, so this has been, like I said, there's the work that I'm doing that has been now that we put under the heading of Indigenous Mind Project. And so what the Indigenous Mind Project is essentially is our structure for being able to take an MBSR course, or now the Indigenous Mind course, and substitute in class by class a particular tribe's tradition. So for example, you know, even though we don't have a pan-Indian course, week 2 can still have yoga dance, right? That we bring in a particular tribe's dance in. So and then when they go to a specific tribe, they can plug their dance into it. Or we can still have a particular thing around a hand, like at Narragansett, we're doing hand weaving, and that's very mindful. We're also doing beading. So we can use, you know, what would be similar for that if we were going to do that at Navajo, or if we're going to do that at Apache, you know. So we have the structure of the course, and that's what we call Indigenous Mind, and we're able to adapt it to other communities. And this is an example of work that's being done by my colleagues at Chickasaw, where they've been taking the Indigenous Mind structure and they've been applying it towards mothers who have gestational diabetes. And so next slide would be good. So they're taking Indigenous Mind and bringing it to gestational diabetes. This is our team. These are the people mostly at University of Oklahoma Health Sciences. Next slide. And this is like kind of an example of what they had done to adjust the class so it fit what the needs of these GDM moms were. So class 1, there's a theme for each class, and usually class 1 is there's more right with you than wrong with you, which is the regular class 1 MBSR theme. But they were putting it in this context of wholeness and having an opening practice with guided sitting and mindful movement. an eating meditation and body scan, but they would also focus in on bringing in particular health education. That's another part of what the Indigenous mind brings in, is that usually we're focused on a particular health outcome, either right now diabetes or hypertension. So, and at Chickasaw, their health outcome is looking at gestational diabetes. So we include specific health education in each one of these things. And for their GDM focuses on mindful eating. And but then they were bringing in class one, the tribal cultural elements would be an opening prayer and a story about the four directions, which we may get to, and a concluding prayer. And being able to give people that had home practice stuff that was reflective of the week that they had done. But this is an example of kind of how the Indigenous mind sort of works, and ways that we can be flexible to each one of the tribes. And this is how they've been doing it at OU. So next slide. So I wanted to take a time before we go to conclusion, if people would join me, if you're interested. We have developed, I wanted to take you through one of the mindful meditation practices that we've adapted. So if you choose to, and you can probably take this moment, then we'll be coming back at 15 past the hour for question time. But if you want to, you can join me, and I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off. You could do the same if you choose. What I'd like you to do is to find your seat. It's just finding a space where you feel like you're sitting in a spot, either in a chair or on a pillow or a cushion, or lying down or standing up even. But finding your space and being present. And if you're sitting, having your feet on the floor, allowing the bottom of your feet to be very heavy, and relaxing in your thighs, and allowing your butt to be very heavy without any resistance to hold it up. And in contrast, having a nice straight spine, and that's aligned with your neck and your head, and not a stiff spine, just long and straight, as though there was a string on the top of your head, just slightly pulling you taut. Allowing your shoulders to relax and your shoulder blades to just melt down your back. And taking a moment and just feeling yourself sitting here, present, dignified, relaxed. And noticing your breathing. In several of the traditions that I've worked in, we explored what is the word for breath. And it turned out that in many of the communities I worked in, there was no specific word for breath the way we think about it, as having this, this cycle of taking in oxygen and different nutrients and then releasing the things that we don't need in our body, this regular cardiovascular activity, that the words around that are much bigger and are more exemplified by a concept of the winds. And I think in Narragansett, the word is Nawashang. And I think in Paiute, it's Hoka. And I don't remember what it is in Chickasaw, but there are these words, and they're not specifically about breath, but more about these winds, and these winds that are connected to all of the generations. And what Michael Yellowbird was recently talking about was that we're never alone. You weren't there, but Michael was talking about it to me. And he said that we're never alone, that our ancestors are around us all the time. And that for Indigenous people, this is a source of strength. This is a source of connection. And that, so these words for wind are also bringing in the blessings from that the winds from the four directions are bringing those blessings from our ancestors to us in that breath. And more importantly, like specifically, I think in the word Hoka, is that it's connected to Creator itself, that these winds, that each breath that we take in and they have different components, whether we face to the east and you're bringing in the winds of change and rebirth, or facing to the south, or facing to the west, or facing to the north, where each one of the south, west, and north winds bring their own sense of power and rejuvenation and wisdom that comes in that wind. So when we think about this word for breath, it incorporates all of that stuff going back to Creator and our ancestors, and that they come in the winds, and that with each breath you're bringing that into your body. So as you continue to sit here, what I'd like you to do is focus on each breath as it comes in and as it comes out, but keeping in mind this idea of a deeper connection with each breath that you have to your own ancestors and your own connection to this planet, and your own deeper connection and to being present as a part of this world, not as an observer, but being in the center of the landscape with each breath. And if your mind gets distracted from the breath coming in, that's absolutely to be expected. And part of a mindfulness practice is to recognize when you've been distracted, noting the distraction, and then just coming back to this breath and all of the connections this breath has to the winds of the four directions. Considering the enormity of each breath, feel free to breathe deep and fully. And when you breathe out your offering, your love, your compassion for the elders, your understanding of the pain that they went through, and a recognition of their love for you, perhaps appreciation. Breathing in, breathing out, and letting go of all of the distractions except for awareness of these winds. And about 30 seconds or so will break from here. And I just encourage you to let go of any visualizations and just feel yourself sitting here, breathing in whatever room you're in. And open your eyes and wiggle your fingers and toes if your eyes were closed. And I'll just go ahead and conclude here One of the things I just ask people to consider as they're doing this kind of work is always rechecking, and I try to do this, is just thinking that, am I worthy of receiving uh, this knowledge from these communities, and making sure that the communities I work with, the people have really, principal roles, that they're leading the research. And one thing that's nice is like, so on grants or on on papers, manuscripts, that making sure that they, it's really cool to put like climate tribal health and United Indian Health Service or whatever, on the author list. So really making sure that they have primary role. Slide. Um, I think working with Indigenous communities, paying a lot of attention to the culture and the history, like we were talking about before, and emphasizing what your contribution to the community is going to be. And I can't say enough about making good connections with a small group of people who can help guide your research, and help guide your work, and tell you who to avoid and who to be in contact with, and to be there a lot. And next slide. And so a bunch of people to thank. So, and that's it. Any questions people have?
Thank you. That was wonderful, Jeff. Let's see, yeah. So people have questions. I haven't checked the chat yet, but please feel free to.
Oh, I don't think Karen Hooker's on there. Karen Hooker should be thank you on there. A lot of people should be on there, especially my students. They make it all worth it.
So I have a question. I can jump in if that's okay.
Sure.
So, hi, Jeff. I'm Kim.
Hi.
And I've heard your name for so long from colleagues at Brown and also colleagues at UConn that you're collaborating with. So it's nice to finally meet you, at least on Zoom. And I live in Rhode Island and have done most of my research here for most of my career. And I'm wondering if you could speak more about working with the Narragansetts, because unlike some of the other tribes in the country, they don't have really land or a reservation, and people are not living together in one place. So I'm just wondering how maybe it might have been different working with them, or maybe talk a little bit more about what you have done with them, and just anything that you think would be of interest. So
Oh
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And they have a very similar. So it's interesting you bring that up, because like the demographics and I think just the logistics of working with the nations in New England are a lot different than, like, let's say Navajo or Chickasaw, or and whereas like Chickasaw's got their own big hospital, and they are very much, they've got their own health um, programs and things like that. So Narragansett has, so even though they don't, and that makes it difficult from a health research point of view, because like, how am I going to find patients, right? They're scattered all over. There isn't one hospital to like go and grab people and so on. So working with them has been a lot about being as much as we can as being a part of community building. Like, so one of the things that we're doing is there's a group of people that we're going to be working with that are families that wanted to get together to explore culture. And so what we want to do is, and they didn't, that's kind of the whole definition of their group is operational, is that, we're just going to meet on weekends and do culture. And that was it. So we're connecting now, and we're going to be meeting with this family group with little kids, and we're going to be bringing in doing mindfulness like we're talking about with culture. We have a new we're making a video for that brings in stomp dance so that the little kids and the kids can learn how to do stomp dance as a part of doing the, but it's also yoga. And, it starts out with like doing yoga and movement and being aware of body awareness and stretching and being aware of movement. But then it breaks into the dance. And so each week we'll learn, like in week 1, they'll learn a couple of the steps. In week 2, they'll learn a couple more. In week 3, it'll just be brought, unfolded over the several weeks of the actual group. And so they'll have learned the stomp dance as a part of that and engage in mindfulness as well. So and then we're doing also, so we've done mindfulness with adults, and we plan on also doing some stuff with kids. Once again, the whole point is how can we use mindfulness to sort of inject we're looking at some dances like the Eastern blanket dance, which is very specific. Stomp dance being more ceremonial and common to lots of people that anyone can dance, whereas Eastern blanket dance being very more specific. And we are looking at ways of bringing that stuff in. So our work with Narragansett has been a lot about trying to identify, like we've resurrected a cookbook that we want to be able to use as part of our interventions, because around diabetes and healthy hearts, there's going to be a lot around food and our relationship with food. And so we like to think about ways of reintroducing the traditional foods that the Narragansett had. And so there is no cookbook like that. There's a lot of other people that have recipes that now we're kind of the center of that we're kind of compiling all that stuff. So I think that's been our relationship with Narragansett, is trying to be a part of sort of the aggregation of cultural knowledge and thinking about ways of efficiently delivering that to the community, So, yeah, and that's kind of similar to Mohegan too. We're doing some work up there, though we're doing a lot more researchy stuff in Mohegan than we are at Narragansett. But a lot of the whole idea is that we're gonna, at one point, so like if we develop a mindfulness thing at Mohegan that has Mohegan traditions in it, I mean, there's a lot of talk about combining the public health and some of the delivery of health across Narragansett, Mashantucket, Pequot, and Mohegan. And so, and we're thinking, well, maybe our mindfulness program could be a part of that, like, and we could see how that could be shared across the different tribes. And so logistically and administratively, it'll give them a chance to sort of, work out, see how all that works, right? And who gets paid and how do they get paid and all that good stuff. So we can use the mindfulness program as a way of doing that. So it's also, we're using the mindfulness stuff we're doing as a way of bringing together and aggregating the tribe's resources across that part of New England anyways.
Very cool. Well, my background is nutrition, physical activity, weight, and I've been interested in mindfulness. So I'd love to talk more about potential collaborations and
sure, absolutely.
In UConn and in Rhode Island. So yeah, I'll reach out to you later on. But thank you. This was really good talk.
And a lot of our big focus. So I just had 2 students. I have a lot of students, and I just had 2 students join my thing. And what they're going to be working on is specifically food. And I brought them down there on Sunday. We went on Sunday to Narragansett. We went to their greenhouse and also to some of their growing areas. And we're going to be really focusing. And those 2 people, Isa and Marina, are really, I have them tasked, so I've got one student tasked to be the dance czar, and he's going to be making the videos and doing all that stuff because he has a background in dance, and also, and he's from Pine Ridge, and so, stomp dance. And these 2 people are also, I've got them working now on focusing on all the food aspects and how we're going to bring that in. And that's always been a major part of any of the work we've done in Indigenous communities, is how do we incorporate the gardens? How do we incorporate traditional eating? Even outside of thinking about a health intervention, like that's been a big, thing as part of. So I think that that's a really fruitful area for us to explore, of like, how can we make the food aspect, being in the garden and touching the dirt and planting seeds, that's very mindful. That's why people like gardening, because they're fully present doing that, and not thinking about the past and the future, and so how can we make that a mindful thing, but also grow some squash and beans and corn, and what that means.
Great. Thank you very much.
I can't see the chat, so if there's any questions, can you forward?
I had a question. First, thank you for your presentation. I'm currently working with a colleague piloting a mindfulness and well-being intervention where we're incorporating the Indigenous concept of M3EWB from South America. And so I'm really interested in learning more about your work. The question that I had was if you could speak a little bit about getting funding for your research and how you work around the issue of community adaptation and convincing reviewers to see that as a strength of the intervention rather than a fidelity of implementation problem or a problem of generalization.
Yeah, I don't know. I've just been lucky, because that's a really difficult. Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's really tough because I actually have to write a proposal that says, in NIH, they want pretty good predictions. What are you going to get? We expect that there's going to be this much change of cortisol at the cortisol awakening response based upon, what these people did before, right? That's what they're looking for. And I'm saying like, well, it really depends on what the community says and we'll know more and then we can build on that. It's this inductive, deductive process as we move forward and that's the best you're going to get. So, and I don't know, maybe it's just, it must be the grantspersonship part, I think it's how do you set up the argument that this is, I think is, and to me, there is no other way for us to be able to make those adaptations other than being able to do the community-based participatory work. And one thing I'm relying on is that it seems as though both NIH and different institutions are starting to recognize that moves slower and it may not be as precise at first as they might be looking for, but that's kind of the only way to move to get that work, to get a deeper understanding of how these look in different communities. So I would focus on that, like saying, look, telling them that, you're supposed to be giving me a break, right? Because I'm doing this type of work. So, or at least more understanding. And like, even on my own faculty activity report, there is a whole page on community-based work. So, and then that's where I shine, on all the like number of publications, I just skip over that one. But it's yeah, so I think that would be my, thinking a lot about the grantspersonship of how do you make that argument, because and then noting the necessity that A, it's that this is the only way to get that, and B, that you or something about your idea is the best way to get it, right? Because I think a lot of these communities is thinking about access to like who that whole trust thing comes up, and who are these communities willing to work with, and if they can develop trust with you, then they're gonna want to work with you and help you with your knowledge. If they can't develop that trust, then they're not going to want to do that work. So I think that's a lot of the things that the academy runs into, is that they don't trust the academy, and so if you can kind of express that, that the approach you have and the questions that you, and the way that you're answering that question is that this is the best study to do that. I think that's what they respond to, because they don't want to just give out money to people. They want to give money to people who might be able to have access and get things done with that community.
Thanks, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and if there's any other questions, you can feel free to send a note if I can help. But yeah, that was my thing. It's difficult submitting a proposal saying, I don't know how this is going to work out. And just think, and so what I end up doing is writing my dream proposal, because I'm like, there's no way that they're gonna want to get behind this, so I might as well make it as fun and juicy as I can. So and I think maybe that's the other thing, that's maybe why they approve it, is because it sounds like it's all going to be fun and exciting, and because I had no expectations of getting these awards, so and then they give it. They're like, hey, here you go.
That's great. Jeff, do you mostly go to NCCIH or do you try some of the other, like the Minority Health Institute or some of the other specific?
Mostly NCCIH or NIA is where I started. So, and I'll probably be going back to them. So yeah, I just stay with them. And that's, because one of the things like with the health disparities, right? The Health Disparities Institute, that every application they get is going to be health disparities. Whereas at NCCIH, they're only going to see like 3. You know? So my health then is going to be at all looking at some kind of help us me about a particular idea and it just sort of fell apart. But I would consider submitting to them. But I stick with NCCIH generally.
Okay.
Hey, Jeffrey.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi, Carolyn.
How are you doing?
Good.
Thanks for a good talk. And I wanted to just really like the fact that you're doing artwork as part of mindfulness. When I was in Australia, I went to an Indigenous art demonstration, and it was really clear that the woman artist doing the painting was as focused and present as any Tibetan Lama doing sand paintings. So, but one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, and we've done work showing that mindfulness practices are in a lot of different traditions, and I suspect just about every tradition. And so I have a problem with the idea. So it's good to allow it to flourish within the particular context, whether that's Indigenous or Christian or Buddhist or Jewish or Islamic or whatever, or African. But I have a hard time with the idea that we have to decolonize it because, in its present incarnation, it's taken from East Asian Buddhism. And so, and yes, it's been sort of Americanized, and yes, it needs to be adjusted, adapted to each culture. But to me, that's not decolonization. We're not imposing it on anyone. We're just a conduit for sharing it.
Oh yeah, I guess I hope I didn't give that impression. I mean, I don't think it's the society that's colonizing in general that's caused these brains to do it. I see mindfulness as a way of the actual decolonizing itself. Like mindfulness doesn't need to be decolonized. That's like part of that's the tool. That's the way out.
Right, exactly. And showing that, we're out of time. Yeah, I know. Okay.
But thank you for that point, Carolyn. That was great. And thank you so much for your talk. There was a bit of a misunderstanding about having a discussion afterwards because we really wanted to do that. So we're hoping to find another time. So I know there's a lot of interest in this work. So the network is gonna try to find another time to have a conversation and give people more of an opportunity. But I'm gonna have to email Jeff on using something besides UConn email because it's not working. But thank you for your talk today. It was really, really wonderful. Really enjoyed it.
It's good to see you, Carolyn. I'll see you soon.
Good to see you too, Jeffrey. Let's talk.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
This is great. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Maritza.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.